Picture this. It's 1989, and you're standing at the starting line of an NHRA Pro stock race. The air is thick with tire smoke and nitromethane fumes. Two identical-looking race cars pull up to the line, engines cackling through their open headers. They've got the same displacement limits, the same weight requirements, the same everything according to the rulebook. But when the Christmas tree drops, one car launches like it's been shot from a cannon, while the other seems stuck in molasses. By the 60-foot mark, there's already a car length between them. What you've just witnessed isn't driver skill or reaction time. It's the result of one of the most ingenious, rule-bending schemes in drag racing history. Bob Glidden wasn't just another racer. This Arizona-based pro stock legend had already accumulated 10 NHRA championships by 1989, making him arguably the most successful drag racer of his generation. But in the late 1980s, the competition was getting fierce. General Motors teams had massive factory support. Chrysler was throwing money at their Mopar programs. And here was Glidden, essentially a privateer running Ford Power, watching his competitive edge slowly evaporate. The rules were strict. Every engine had to be 500 cubic inches. Weight minimums were enforced to the pound. Even the type of fuel was regulated. So how do you find an advantage when everything is supposedly equal? The answer came from understanding something fundamental about internal combustion engines that most people overlook. See, everyone obsesses over displacement, compression ratios, cam profiles, and boost pressure. But there's another variable that's just as critical: air temperature. Cold air is denser than hot air. Denser air means more oxygen molecules in the same volume. More oxygen means you can burn more fuel. More fuel burned means more power. It's basic chemistry, but the implications are staggering. For every 10-degree Fahrenheit drop in intake air temperature, you gain approximately 1% in power. Doesn't sound like much? Keep that number in mind. Now here's where it gets interesting. Pro stock cars in 1989 were running Root-style superchargers, cramming air into those 500 cubic inch engines at pressures that would destroy your average street engine in seconds. But when you compress air, you heat it up. It's physics, the same principle that makes your bicycle pump get hot when you're inflating a tire. These superchargers were heating the intake air to well over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to bake cookies. That superheated air was killing power potential, and everyone knew it. That's why intercoolers existed. An intercooler is essentially a radiator for your intake air. The compressed air from the supercharger passes through it, and ambient air flowing over the intercooler's fins pulls heat away. On a good day, with the efficient intercooler, you might drop your intake temperatures from 300 degrees down to maybe 150 degrees. That's a significant improvement, worth maybe 40 or 50 horsepower. Every pro stock team was running the best intercoolers money could buy, all achieving roughly similar results. The playing field was level, or so everyone thought. Bob Glidden looked at his intercooler and saw an opportunity. The rules said you had to run an intercooler of a certain size. They specified materials, dimensions, even mounting locations. But nowhere in that thick NHRA rulebook did it say anything about what temperature the intercooler itself had to be. And that's when Glidden had his eureka moment. What if, instead of relying on ambient air to cool the intercooler, you pre-chilled it to sub-zero temperatures? Enter dry ice. This solid form of carbon dioxide sits at negative 109.3 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't melt like regular ice. It sublimates, turning directly from a solid into a gas. No mess, no water to deal with, just pure cooling potential. Glidden's crew developed a system where they would pack the intercooler with dry ice before each run. We're talking about 20 to 30 pounds of the stuff, carefully positioned to maximize contact with the intercooler's internal passages. The preparation took place in the staging lanes, hidden under towels and covers, away from prying eyes. The results were staggering. that 300-degree air coming out of the supercharger? By the time it passed through Glidden's super-chilled intercooler, it was dropping to below freezing. We're talking about intake air temperatures of 30 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Sometimes ice crystals would actually form in the intake manifold. Compare that to his competitors' 150-degree intake temps, and you're looking at a 120-degree advantage. Remember that 1% per 10 degrees rule? Glidden was seeing 12 to 15% more power. Let's put that in real numbers. A competitive Pro Stock engine in 1989 was making around 750 horsepower when it rolled up to the starting line. That was with a conventional intercooler doing its best to manage heat. Glidden's ice-packed setup, his engines were making over 900 horsepower at launch. But here's the really clever part. This advantage only lasted for the first half of the quarter mile. As the dry ice sublimated and the intercooler warmed up, his power advantage gradually disappeared. By the time he crossed the finish line, his engine was making roughly the same power as everyone else's. This created a fascinating dynamic. Glidden would absolutely destroy his competition off the starting line. His 60-foot times were otherworldly. While other cars were struggling to hook up all their power, Glidden's Ford was already 2 car lengths ahead. In drag racing, especially in the tightly regulated Pro Stock class, that kind of early lead is almost impossible to overcome. Even as his power advantage faded through the run, momentum and aerodynamics meant he could maintain most of that lead to the finish line. The data backs this up. During the 1989 season, Glidden's reaction times and 60-foot splits were consistently better than anyone else's, even though his trap speeds weren't significantly higher. He was winning races in the first 200 feet, and nobody could figure out why. Other teams inspected his engines, looking for illegal modifications. They found nothing. The NHRA technical inspectors went over his car with a fine-tooth comb after every victory. Completely legal. The intercooler was the right size, the right shape, made of the right materials. Nobody thought to check its temperature. The beauty of Glidden's scheme was its simplicity. He wasn't using exotic materials or hidden components. Dry ice was readily available at any grocery store. The modification to the intercooler was minimal, just some strategic placement of insulation to keep the dry ice in contact with the core. The entire system probably cost less than $1,000 to implement. Yet it was worth more than hundreds of thousands of dollars in engine development. Think about what other teams were doing to find 200 horsepower. They were spending fortunes on exotic cylinder head designs, having camshafts custom ground to gain maybe 20 horsepower. Intake manifolds were being tested and refined in million-dollar flow benches for single-digit gains. Teams were experimenting with different piston designs, rod ratios, bore and stroke combinations, all searching for that elusive extra power. And here was Glidden, buying dry ice from the local Safeway and crushing everyone. The sublimation process itself was perfectly suited for drag racing. As the carbon dioxide transformed from solid to gas, it absorbed massive amounts of heat energy, 571 kilojoules per kilogram to be exact. That's more cooling power than regular ice could ever provide. Plus, the CO2 gas would vent harmlessly out of the intercooler, not affecting the air-fuel mixture or combustion process. It was elegant engineering, hiding in plain sight. But the real genius was in how Glidden's team managed the system. They had to calculate exactly how much dry ice to use for each atmospheric condition. Too little, and the advantage wouldn't last long enough. Too much, and they'd be carrying unnecessary weight. Temperature sensors were hidden throughout the intake system, feeding data to the crew. They developed charts showing optimal dry ice quantities for different ambient temperatures, humidity levels, and altitude corrections. This wasn't just throwing some ice in a cooler and hoping for the best. This was precision engineering. The psychological advantage was almost as significant as the horsepower gain. Imagine being Glidden's competitor. You've spent millions developing your engine program. Your team includes some of the best engineers in motorsport. You're confident your 750 horsepower engine is as good as anyone's. Then you pull up next to Glidden, and he absolutely annihilates you off the starting line, not by a fender, but by entire car lengths. Your first thought isn't that he's cheating. After all, NHRA inspects everything. You assume his team has found some incredible engineering breakthrough. So you go back to the shop and spend more money, chase more power, trying to catch up to something that costs less than your lunch budget. The dry ice also provided unexpected benefits beyond just cooling. As it sublimated, the expanding CO2 gas created a localized high-pressure zone around the intercooler. This actually helped force more air through the core, improving its efficiency even further. The cold temperatures also increased the density of the air charge so dramatically that Glidden could actually run slightly less boost pressure than his competitors while making more power. Lower boost meant less stress on engine components, improving reliability. For nearly 2 full seasons, Glidden dominated pro stock racing with this advantage. He won race after race, championship after championship. Other teams were going crazy trying to figure out his secret. They dynoed their engines, compared them to estimated numbers from Glidden's performance, and couldn't understand the discrepancy. Some accused him of running illegal nitrous oxide. Others thought he had some exotic fuel additive. Nobody suspected frozen carbon dioxide. The end came not through discovery, but through observation. At a race in 1990, a competing crew chief noticed something odd. Glidden's crew was always handling his car with heavy gloves in the staging lanes, even on hot days. Vapor was occasionally visible around the hood scoop area, like morning mist, and there was always a Coleman cooler that traveled with Glidden's car to the starting line, but never came back. Curiosity piqued, investigations began, and eventually the secret was out. When NHRA officials finally understood what Glidden had been doing, they were in a difficult position. Technically, he hadn't broken any rules. The rulebook was extensive, covering everything from valve angles to spark plug reaches, but nowhere did it address intercooler temperature. They couldn't retroactively punish him for being clever, but they also couldn't allow this to continue, as other teams were threatening to protest or even leave the series. The rules change came swift and specific. Starting in the 1991 season, NHRA explicitly banned the use of any substance to artificially cool intercoolers below ambient temperature. No ice, no dry ice, no liquid nitrogen, no refrigerants of any kind. The intercooler had to work with ambient air only. They even instituted random temperature checks in the staging lanes, using infrared thermometers to ensure compliance. The playing field was forcibly leveled. But here's the thing about racers like Bob Glidden. They don't just find one advantage and ride it forever. As soon as the ice ban went into effect, he was already working on the next innovation. His response to the rule change was to focus on intercooler efficiency through design rather than temperature manipulation. His team developed new core designs with increased surface area, better flow characteristics, and improved heat transfer rates. They couldn't make the intercooler colder than ambient, but they could make it much more effective at reaching ambient temperature. The impact of Glidden's ice trick extended far beyond just his own success. It fundamentally changed how teams approached pro stock development. Before Glidden, everyone focused on making more power through traditional means, bigger cams, better heads, more compression. After Glidden, teams realized that managing heat was just as important as making power in the first place. Intercooler development became a priority. Teams started experimenting with water injection, methanol sprays, and other legal cooling methods. The automotive aftermarket took notice too. High-performance intercooler manufacturers started developing new designs inspired by the lessons learned from Glidden's exploitation of temperature dynamics. Heat exchangers became more sophisticated. the understanding that intake temperature was as critical as boost pressure filtered down to street performance enthusiasts. Today, every serious turbocharged or supercharged build includes extensive heat management strategies, a direct legacy of Glidden's innovation. Modern Pro stock cars, now naturally aspirated by rule, still carry lessons from the ice era. Teams obsess over air temperature, using every legal means to keep intake charges cool. Ram air systems are precisely tuned to capture the coolest possible air. Some teams even paint their intake manifolds white to reflect heat rather than absorb it. The quarter degree here, half degree there mentality that Glidden proved could win championships persists throughout professional drag racing. The technical specifications of Glidden's setup were remarkable for their time. His intercooler core measured 18 inches by 12 inches by 4 inches thick, the maximum size allowed by NHRA rules. The internal passage volume was approximately 2.8 liters. When packed with dry ice, the core temperature would drop to -80 degrees Fahrenheit within minutes. Heat transfer calculations showed that in the 1.2 seconds it took for charged air to pass through during a full throttle run, temperature drops of over 270 degrees were achievable. The engines themselves were mechanical marvels operating at the edge of destruction. Compression ratios of 14:1 were common, with boost adding another 8.1 effective compression. Total cylinder pressures exceeded 3,000 psi at peak torque. The forged aluminum pistons were experiencing acceleration forces of over 8,000 G at maximum RPM. Valve springs were pushing 1,200 pounds of pressure to control valves that were opening and closing 75 times per second. In this environment, every degree of temperature advantage translated directly to survivability and performance. Glidden's data acquisition systems, primitive by today's standards, were revolutionary for the era. He was logging intake air temperature, boost pressure, and exhaust gas temperature at 10 samples per second, unheard of in 1989 pro stock racing. This data proved that intake temperatures were dropping below 32 degrees Fahrenheit in the first 100 feet of the run, creating condensation that actually added mass to the air charge through water vapor. His engines were essentially running on super-oxygenated Arctic air while everyone else was breathing desert heat. The fuel system had to be completely recalibrated to handle the denser air charge. Glidden's team calculated that the ice-cooled air was 28% denser than what competitors were running. This meant fuel injectors had to flow 28% more fuel to maintain the correct air-fuel ratio. They achieved this through a combination of larger injectors and increased fuel pressure, running at 120 psi compared to the standard 80 psi. The fuel pumps alone were consuming 15 horsepower just to maintain pressure. Even the engine oil system was affected by the extreme temperature differentials. The massive temperature gradient between the sub-zero intake charge and the 280-degree oil created unusual thermal stress patterns in the engine block. Glidden's team had to develop special warm-up procedures to prevent thermal shock. They would preheat the engine block while keeping the intercooler isolated, then pack the ice at the last possible moment to minimize thermal stress during the run. The clutch management strategy also changed with the ice system. The massive hit of power off the line required completely different clutch timing. Glidden's crew developed a staged lockup system that would slip the clutch for the first 0.3 seconds to manage the initial 900 horsepower hit, then progressively lock up as the power decreased through the run. This required constant adjustment as atmospheric conditions changed the dry ice sublimation rate. What made this even more impressive was that Glidden was essentially running a privateer operation against factory teams. While GM and Chrysler teams had wind tunnels, flow benches, and armies of engineers, Glidden had creativity, determination, and a willingness to think outside the conventional boundaries. His total research and development budget for the ice system was less than what factory teams spent on catering for a single race weekend. The man himself was a study in contrasts. Bob Glidden was notorious for his secrecy, often working alone in his shop with the doors locked and windows covered. He trusted no one with his engine secrets, doing all the machine work himself. Yet here he was, using a cooling method that any high school chemistry student could understand. The sophistication wasn't in the concept, but in the execution. The precise management of sublimation rates, the insulation strategies, the timing of the ice packing. Other teams tried to copy the system once they learned about it, but none achieved Glidden's level of success. They would pack ice haphazardly, use the wrong quantities, or fail to properly insulate the core. Some teams tried regular ice, not understanding that the water runoff would actually hurt performance by displacing air in the intake tract. Others used too much dry ice, making their intercoolers so cold that moisture from the air would freeze solid in the core, blocking airflow. Glidden had spent months perfecting every aspect of the system. The NHRA's reaction to the ice discovery revealed the constant tension in professional racing between innovation and regulation. Racing organizations want close competition to maintain spectator interest, but they also need to allow innovation to prevent stagnation. Glidden's ice trick highlighted this perfectly. It was creative, it was legal under existing rules, but it created an unfair advantage that threatened the integrity of competition. The rule change was inevitable, but it also showed that NHRA respected ingenuity enough to let Glidden keep his victories. In interviews years later, Glidden would smile when asked about the ice era. He never apologized for finding the advantage, viewing it as part of racing's fundamental challenge. Go fast within the rules as written, not as intended. He pointed out that every successful team in racing history has found similar advantages, some in aerodynamics, some in tires, some in fuel chemistry. His just happened to involve frozen carbon dioxide and thermodynamics. The legacy of the ice trick extends beyond just technical innovation. It demonstrated that in racing, as in life, the biggest advantages often come from questioning assumptions. Everyone assumed intercoolers had to work at ambient temperature because that's how they'd always worked. Glidden asked why. That simple question led to a 200 horsepower advantage that dominated professional drag racing for 2 seasons. Today's pro stock cars make over 1,500 horsepower naturally aspirated, nearly double what Glidden's supercharged engines produced with ice. But the principles he proved remain relevant. Modern teams use ceramic coatings to reflect heat, titanium components for their low thermal mass, and exotic materials that didn't exist in 1989. They measure intake air temperature to the 10th of a degree and adjust timing accordingly. The tools have evolved, but the understanding that temperature is power remains unchanged. Young engineers studying motorsport often analyze Glidden's ice system as a case study in creative problem solving. It demonstrates that innovation doesn't always require millions of dollars or cutting-edge technology. Sometimes the best solution is the simplest one that everyone else overlooked. It also shows the importance of understanding fundamental principles rather than just following conventional wisdom. The story also highlights the sporting aspect of professional racing. Glidden could have kept his secret through intimidation or misdirection, sending competitors on wild goose chases. Instead, when discovered, he acknowledged the innovation and moved on to the next challenge. This sportsmanship, combined with his innovative spirit, is why Bob Glidden remains one of the most respected figures in drag racing history, ice or no ice. For enthusiasts building their own performance cars, Glidden's ice trick, while now illegal in most sanctioned racing, taught valuable lessons about intake temperature management. The aftermarket responded with better intercoolers, water methanol injection systems, and innovative ducting designs. Every turbocharged sport compact with a front-mount intercooler owes something to the attention Glidden brought to charge air cooling. What would have happened if Glidden's ice trick had never been banned? It's fascinating to consider. We might have seen an arms race in cooling technology, with teams experimenting with liquid nitrogen, phase change materials, or even more exotic solutions. The cost and complexity would have spiraled out of control, potentially pricing smaller teams out of competition entirely. The NHRA's ban, while ending Glidden's advantage, probably saved pro stock racing from becoming a chemistry experiment. Bob Glidden passed away in 2017, but his influence on drag racing remains immeasurable. He won 85 NHRA national events and 10 championships, many during the ice era. But more than statistics, he left a legacy of innovation, showing that creative thinking could overcome budget disadvantages. His ice-cooled intercooler remains one of the most ingenious rule exploitations in motorsport history, a perfect example of working smarter, not just harder. The next time you watch a drag race, pay attention to those first crucial feet after launch. That's where races are really won or lost, in that violent explosion of power that sends 3,000-pound cars hurtling toward 150 miles per hour in under 7 seconds. And remember that for 2 glorious seasons, one man found a way to make his explosion just a little more violent than everyone else's, using nothing more than frozen carbon dioxide and the laws of thermodynamics. The lesson from Glidden's Ice Age is timeless. Racing isn't just about who has the biggest budget or the best equipment. It's about who can look at the same rules everyone else is reading and see opportunities others miss. It's about understanding not just how things work, but why they work that way. And sometimes it's about having the audacity to show up at the biggest race of the year with a cooler full of dry ice and a plan to rewrite the record books. What's your favorite example of creative rule bending in racing history? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on whether innovations like Glidden's should be celebrated or banned. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of drag racing's most ingenious technical exploits, make sure to subscribe for more stories of engineering brilliance hiding in plain sight.